Good afternoon for those who are already in the room. Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to our online event today on the invitation of Reinhard Bütikofer. We will start slowly, shortly, as there are still participants joining right now. Please be patient for a few seconds. Thank you. We are very pleased to have such a good number of participants who are interested in the topic and coming from various diverse backgrounds joining the discussion and the launch of the study today. As it is 2 minutes past 12, I think most of you are now in the room and we can officially start. Once again, good afternoon and a very warm welcome to today's online event on the invitation of Reinhard Bütikofer. My name is Christina Sardela, and I have the great honor and pleasure to moderate the event today. Thank you, Reinhard, for giving me that opportunity. I have previously worked with the Heinrich Böll Foundation, but I'm now an independent researcher pursuing my own research projects. Thank you all for joining. The focus today will be the presentation and discussion of a newly published study conducted by Bertram Lang and commissioned by Reinhard Bütikofer on behalf of the Greens and the European Free Alliance at the European Parliament. It's titled Addressing the Civil Society Blind Spot in European-China Relations. And I'm very much looking forward to the event. Before we start, let me briefly introduce the excellent speakers I have the honor to have on the panel, on the virtual panel today. Mr. Bertram Lang, who is going to present his study. He's a political scientist, an expert on China's nonprofit sector, as well as EU-China relations. He currently serves as the academic coordinator of the, what's it called, Interdisciplinary Centre for East Asian Studies at the Goethe University at Frankfurt am Main. Besides that, he's also a freelance advisor for European nonprofit and public organizations in the field of global China strategy. He has plenty of academic as well as practical experience. I'm very happy to have him here today. He's going to present, but before he's going to present his study, I will then first hand over to Reinhard Bütikofer, whom I don't think I need to officially extensively introduce here. You all know him as one of the key people when it comes to shaping EU-China relations and EU-China policies. Among many positions he holds, he is the Foreign Affairs Coordinator for the Greens at the Committee of Foreign Affairs, as well as the chair of the European Parliament's delegations for relations with China. I will ask Reinhard firstly to give us a little bit of context why he has commissioned the study and why he thinks it is important. After the presentation then, Reinhard will kick off the discussions with comments and questions before we open the floor to all of and the discussions to all of you. For that, later, please use the Q&A function. Be brief that we can hear as many contributions as possible, or you can also raise your hands and my colleagues will unmute you to ask your questions in person. One last comment before we start. This event actually was planned to be an in-person event in Berlin as well as in Brussels, in fact, in cooperation with the Heinrich Böll Foundation. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic situations, we can only host it here online today, but the event is not cancelled, it's only postponed. And this will be then a great opportunity to continue, broaden and deepen the discussions from today, since we only have 1 hour. So without further ado, Reinhard, the floor is yours on why you have commissioned this study and to give us a little bit of background and political context.
Thank you very much, Christina. Thanks for moderating this, and welcome to Bertram Lang also, who will present his study shortly. 1 year ago, most of us would not have expected that by the end of that year, we would have a final result of the 7 years long negotiations over a comprehensive agreement on investment between China and the EU. Once that was pulled through, there was immediately an effort, particularly in the European Parliament, to look at this negotiated result from different angles. And even though for the last several months, CAI has mostly only been mentioned in the context of the sanctions that China imposed on members of the European Parliament, and in the context of the decision of the European Parliament to put CAI in the fridge because of that, there had been important and interesting conversations analyzing the different aspects of this negotiated agreement. And we have contributed to that from the very beginning. The first study we published in that context was a study by PISM. More recently, we published a study that Tim Rühlig conducted about the aspect of standardization. And today I have the honor of helping to present the study that Bertram Lang did on the civil society dimension of this agreement. And there is more work to come. So we're not just criticizing the fact that China is trying to impose its dictate on the European Parliament. We're also willing to contribute to an adequate assessment. And in that regard, I think there is indeed a blind spot that Mr. Lang has dealt with. And I'm very happy to be able to now introduce him and listen together with all of you to his presentation of his study.
Thank you, Reinhard, for the explanation and the context. So Bertram, the floor is yours for your presentation. Please be within 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina and Reinhard, for the kind introduction. So first of all, I'd also like to express my pleasure in this great interest in this topic, which is usually not a priority topic, unfortunately, in European China policy, and especially not in the context of trade and investment. As you said, we agreed to only 15 minutes presentation, so there can only be some snapshots into the study. And of course, I do hope to raise your interest in reading the full study, which will be made available in the chat function also at the end of this talk today. It was written against the backdrop of the Kai and also based on my interviews with stakeholders from civil society, business, and EU policymakers. However, the study also tried to make some broader points regarding civil society in EU-China policy, based both on my research and previous interviews in the EU-China context over the past years. I would like to jump right into the matter in the beginning and give you 4 key messages that I would like to hope and get across today. The first one is that defending the right of nonprofit organizations to operate transnationally should be a matter of principle for the EU. This is not because European NGOs are meant to tell the EU story right, to paraphrase the Communist Party here, but because a diversity of actors in international politics is absolutely crucial from an EU perspective, since the EU is not conducting the gist of its foreign policy and international presence through military means, fortunately, and also realistically. Focusing on this diversity of actors is a benefit per se, and this is both true from a perspective of European values and of interests. Anyway, I don't like this opposition of values and interests, but I think it complies with both. The second is that civil society actors are both essential channels of international engagement, including with China in these difficult times, and a source of expertise and firsthand knowledge. In reality, unfortunately, they are often seen as either irrelevant, or maybe even worse, as tools of foreign policy. And I think looking back in nonprofit studies at the years of the Bush administration, where a civil society promotion was used as a tool of foreign policy, we see how devastating that has been, and we should not fall into that trap. Thirdly, the EUChina Kai, for me, exemplifies the current neglect for civil society in the EU's China policy. This means I don't subscribe to some media reports which have painted Kai as a direct threat to nonprofits, in the sense that now, henceforth, all NGOs and business chambers will have to be led by Chinese board members due to the Kai. But the issues I will highlight do fit into a larger picture of what I consider to be wrong priorities in European China policy. And finally, the study makes several concrete recommendations, which boil down to the idea that the EU and member states need to find better ways for supporting civil society organizations without instrumentalizing them, both in their China policy and more broadly in trade and investment policy. Now, I'll start with, as the study also does, with some brief background on the role of civil society exchanges in EU-China relations. First of all, it's widely acknowledged in both the Western, but also the Chinese academic literature that non-official channels, including through foundations, NGO partnerships, twinning programs, etc., have been crucial in China's opening up process since the 1980s. Both for China's development, but also, and this is something I would like to focus on here today, since this is about the EU policy side, they've been crucial for our understanding of China beyond the official narrative that's being painted in an increasingly coherent manner under Xi Jinping by the Communist Party itself. So civil society support is not simply about what used to be considered as support for China's democratization. It never really was about that, apart from the major narrative, but it's definitely not the case today. We really have to look at those functions of engagement and understanding. Of course, most of the people attending here today will know that many of these exchanges that used to be possible have become more difficult over the past decade or so. There has been an intensified crackdown on activism and advocacy, especially in fields like labor rights, LGBTQI rights, and many others since 2013. And for European and generally foreign NGOs working in China, one turning point has certainly been the 2016 Overseas NGO Law, which embodies what is often called a securitization of civil society governance, and especially a securitization of foreign NGO activities in China. Unfortunately, there has only been very limited reaction from the European side to that from the beginning. What we had when the law was passed in 2016 was only a local statement by the EU delegation, which first of all supported, I quote, the promotion of law-based governance in China, while indeed raising some concerns about the development of civil society in the context of the law. But it was only a local statement, not a statement in the name of the EU and member states. And I would argue that this very low-key reaction certainly encouraged Chinese authorities to go ahead and also implement the law increasingly rigidly over the past years. We also have another interesting aspect in terms of global China, which I cannot focus on today, but which needs to be mentioned. That is that Chinese NGOs themselves, also having benefited from capacity building and support from European and US actors, are increasingly going out themselves. They're facing many obstacles, but they are contributing to diversifying China's international presence in several regards. And this also does open, in under difficult circumstances, new avenues for cooperation and, or at least dialogue and engagement. Now, let's face it, of course, civil society has never been the focus of European China policy, which was always driven by business interests, and thus the EU-China Kai negotiations initiated in 2012-13 have been a central part of the EU's goal to ensure a level playing field for corporate investors in China. When the Kai was agreed in principle, it was branded by DG Trade at the end of last year as ensuring, I quote, fair treatment for EU companies so they can compete on a better level playing field in China. But then, of course, it was suspended. So this big success of the German Council presidency is currently on hold. And we can discuss, of course, later whether this current suspension may be a chance to make Kai into a better agreement, at least in terms of how it deals with NGOs. So let's focus on the topic of today, of course, apart from the many other issues relating to labor rights and sustainable development that could be raised critically with regards to Kai. Now, what's the issue for NGOs if the Kai is all about business first? Indeed, NGOs were never mentioned before March 2021, when the schedules of commitment, so the annexes to the Kai, were published on the DG Trade website. And now we have this Chinese Annex 2 Entry 9, which has the heading non-profit organizations, which took many in the sector by surprise and also attracted quite some media attention, at least in German media. What does it do? In brief, following the Kai's so-called negative list approach, it excludes non-profit organizations from key protective clauses of this agreement, namely the ones that are mentioned here above, the national treatment clause, which ensures non-discrimination between domestic and foreign entities, and the senior management and board of directors clause, which stipulates that there may be no nationality requirements for leading staff in companies operating in either of the two parties. To quote the European Commission, in Annex 2, the parties list those sectors for which they reserve the right to derogate from those same commitments. Okay, so the annex basically reserves China's or enshrines China's right to discriminate against foreign non-profit organizations. In response to this NGO outcry, especially in Germany, the Commission's line of argument has essentially been, what's your problem? There are many other related claims in the Commission statements and also in German government responses to parliamentary inquiries, which are dissected in the study in more detail, including a conflation between the WTO commitments, which use a positive list, and the Kai's negative list approach. But here I would really like to focus on this "why do you care" line of argument of the European Commission. The first issue I have with this is that sure, nonprofits may not be commercial, but many of them are indeed economic actors. There are better figures in the US, where the nonprofit sector is the third employer in terms of sectors in the whole economy, but also in Europe. And looking at the overseas NGO registration statistics, you see that many NGOs that are registered with offices in China actually focus on economic and trade issues. Of course, this is also because business chambers are included in the scope of the ONGO law, which apparently DG Trade was not cognizant of before 2021, so during the negotiation process. But also, of course, because some NGOs are drawn into less sensitive fields by the sheer incentives of the law. But also, if we look at the Kai's main text, it explicitly includes nonprofit entities in its scope. In Article 1.2, it defines enterprise as meaning any entity constituted under the applicable laws, whether or not for profit, including an association or similar organization. And this has become a standard clause in international investment agreements in many of them. And indeed, philanthropic foundations do invest money and have assets in other countries which would need protection, just like commercial investments. Now, the neglect for transnational nonprofit investments is, of course, a more general problem. The EU hasn't really taken up the issue so far. The US is more advanced in some regards, explicitly protecting charities and foundations in some of its BITs. But the problem is always enforcement. Under the current international dispute settlement mechanisms, there would be very limited chances for NGOs and foundations to actually enforce their rights. That's a broader issue I also touch upon in my recommendations when we're talking about reforming international dispute settlement mechanisms. They could be made more accessible for nonprofits with more limited resources than multinational corporations. But again, in theory, they would be included. And this is also obvious from the second perspective that I want to introduce here, which is the Chinese side clearly cares. If we look at how Annex 2 Entry 9 is formulated, we can see, and this is shown in detail in the study, that it closely echoes the overseas NGO law. Why would it do so if Kai was not at all relevant to non-profit actors and NGOs? One motive may be to prevent potential legal challenges. Another may be to have own Chinese norms accepted in international agreements. And this is nicely highlighted in this quote from an interviewee I talked to from the German business community, who described this normative issue quite accurately. That the real issue is for what kind of behavior can I get blessing in international agreements? And I would argue that by agreeing to the Kai under the current state of affairs, this would amount to a de facto acceptance of civil society restrictions currently in place, and maybe even future additional ones by the European side. Because the schedule of commitment is not simply a unilateral document, as the Commission claims. It's the essence where the liberalization happens, and so it must have been part of the actual negotiations. Just consider what would have happened if the Chinese had said, we exclude the automotive industry from the Kai scope. Would the Commission have said, this is a unilateral document, you don't care? Certainly not. Now let's come to the reasons for this inadequate consideration of nonprofit actors in the Kai negotiation process. For me, Kai really exemplifies the EU's conventional approach of keeping business and politics separated in its China policy, which has made it easy traditionally to outsource contentious issues to human rights dialogues and other closed-door formats. But more importantly, from my point of view, civil society did not really have a genuine voice in the whole negotiation process. And what I did to find out about this was to look at the civil society dialogues that DG Trade has conducted over the course of the past years. I'll show you this in two graphs that also appear in the study. I made the effort to go through DG Trade's archives and look at the 8 events that were organized around Kai under the label of civil society dialogues. And I categorized the actors that were present at those dialogues into business actors, civil actors, official, and then some others which were hard to attribute. And what you can see is that even the civil society meetings, not to speak of all the other lobby meetings, are dominated by business actors. And this is something you can see on the right side. Where are the China expert organizations from within civil society in those dialogues? Nowhere to be seen. And of course, you could just go and blame those actors because indeed those civil society dialogues are open for registration. But it's very hard, and this is apparent in a second quote from an interviewee from a European NGO. Those organizations focusing on China and doing the real China work, or even being present and putting all their efforts into maintaining their operations, etc., they are not necessarily the ones who have the expertise to follow up on everything that's happening in Brussels and know when, what kind of civil society dialogue is going on. So there would have to be much more proactive outreach to those nonprofits with actual on-the-ground China expertise here if European policymakers were genuinely interested in this kind of input. And of course, this lack of civil society input also affects all kinds of other areas like sustainable development, like labor rights, and other normative issues. So I can see that I'm already beyond the 15 minutes. So I'm just presenting you as a matter of conclusion with some of the recommendations that I further detail in the study, and which I'm happy to discuss, of course, in more detail. The first one is to address the NGO issue in possible Kai revision negotiations. Reinhard Bütikofer has mentioned that this is now something that may be on the table, and we should actually focus on the Kai in detail. Personally, I'm not opposed to such an agreement being concluded by as a matter of principle. I think this is really about the content of what you put into such an agreement. And here, I think the NGO issue needs to be changed, either omitted if possible, the whole annex. Maybe it may not be possible because, of course, the EU does not have the leverage to change the overseas NGO law, but at least including an insurement that, or an insurance from China that there will not be additional restrictions, so reducing the policy space for further restrictions. Plus, it would need to be accompanied by an EU statement that makes it very clear that the EU does not endorse those restrictions that are currently in place with the overseas NGO law. For the other recommendations, I'm not going through every single one of them now. I'll leave it to your questions to point out where you're specifically interested in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bertram Lang, for your presentation. And thanks for keeping the time. I would first like to invite Reinhard to kick off the discussions with his questions to you, to the study, and his comments, of course. Reinhard.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Lang. What I cherish the most about your study is that it allows us to widen our view, to widen the scope, because you do not just analyze the specific way in which CAI, if ever ratified, might affect the work of NGOs, but you also put that into the context of a wider wider perspective. And if I may just shortly add an anecdote, in 2008, I hosted a deputy minister from the propaganda department of the CCP in Berlin for 3 days. And the program that I organized for him was talking NGOs from the morning to the evening. And I was trying to impress him with a simple message. Allowing NGOs to play their role can help with good governance. It seems my message was lost, or maybe I didn't convince him, or maybe nobody wanted to listen to him if I did. But today, obviously, NGOs are viewed, as you said, very suspiciously, and foreign NGOs are under very restrictive rules. Now, what I want to stress is also for our discussion here that we should walk on 2 feet. We should discuss how your study can teach us, what your study can teach us about dealing with the text of CAI that we have on the table, but also how we can maybe draw wider conclusions. Let me focus on the first. Let me focus first on the text of CAI. I understand, and I think this is the core of your finding in that regard, that international NGOs are not protected in a way that many businesses are, and that a lack of protection would also allow, if the Chinese side would choose to do that, would also allow them to make a requirement that foreign NGOs would have to be directed by a Chinese national. CAI text does not say China imposes that rule, but it leaves a space, a policy space, that would basically provide European acceptance of such a step if it ever happened. And in my understanding, that would go beyond the Foreign NGO Law of 2016, because in that Foreign NGO law, that was excluded. That provision was not there. So as I understand this, this is not only a de facto acceptance, a blessing from the side of the EU for Chinese behavior vis-a-vis international NGOs. It is also carte blanche for even more restrictive Chinese behavior if China would choose to apply such behavior in the future. Please contradict me if this is a wrong description of your finding, but if it is correct, it applies to a wide range of actors. That includes representations for business interests, but also foundations like the Heinrich Böll or Konrad Adenauer Foundation, Friedrich Ebert, and many others. Please give me an idea. This would be my first question. Mm-hmm. If this is where we are, how could you imagine possibly finding a way of undoing the negative impact of that provision, Annex 2, Entry 9? How could we heal possibly that politically very questionable concession that we have made? Have you an idea how that could be managed?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So first of all, just to reiterate this, China does not need the Kai in order to impose such an additional restriction. Actually, when looking at the text of the Overseas NGO law, they wouldn't even have to amend the law itself formally. There's stipulations on senior executives, which do not include a nationality requirement so far, but which do include other or a reference to other measures to be decided through administrative measures. So there is this policy space domestically, but as I said, there's two motivations, I think, from the Chinese side to include this into the annex of the Kai. The one is a more banal bureaucratic thing that I can only assume, of course, this is a black box, but of course, the agreement goes through internal scrubbing on the Chinese side, and then you have the responsible ministry, the Public Security Bureau, probably seeing this national treatment clause and potentially the senior executive clause as being in potential contradiction with the with the Overseas NGO law. So you basically include this provision to be on the safe side. But an additional motivation, and I very much do think this is the case because of China's consistent international legitimation efforts of its own policies, an additional motivation is to enshrine domestic policies and the principles behind them in international agreements. And this is the normative issue, I think, that you correctly described. If you have these provisions in the agreement and the whole agreement is accepted by the EU, then this at least makes it easier for the Chinese side to point to this and say, well, we basically reserve this policy space here and you agree to it. So we're just using the policy space that is in the agreement. This is the way I would put it. Now, in terms of the policy recommendations, as I said at the end of the presentation, I think the ideal would be to just get rid of the entry 9 altogether. And then I quickly mentioned all the difficulties of enforcement, but potentially organizations that feel discriminated against could use this and challenge. But if this is not possible, at least there should be a clear clarification, first of all, that the future policy space of further restrictions is closed. So the EU does not subscribe to further restrictions. And second, the EU should make it clear, this is what I suggest in a under heading number 4 here, with a principled statement on the importance of freedom of association and free flows of transnational civil society funding, which must not be or should not be China specific, but can address this problem that is a more general international problem today, but can also mention the overseas NGO law and clearly state that the EU does not endorse or condone these kind of restrictions being imposed on non-profit funding, and more generally the discrimination between for-profit and non-profit international or transnational investments. And I think this would address at least the normative problem of the EU basically endorsing Chinese and other countries' restrictions against European non-profits here.
Thank you. Indeed, I mean, a lot of what is written in the Kai does exist legally in China already. And it's been some investment openings that the Kai frames have been already granted in the Chinese foreign investment law. But it's always been an argument from DG Trade that enshrining such provisions in an international agreement gives them another status. So basically, if we have a unilateral Chinese law that gives us some investment space, that law could be used, could be changed unilaterally as China sees fit. If this is enshrined in an international agreement that both sides have signed and ratified, then of course there could be a more stringent insistence on implementing provisions of that kind. And the same logic obviously applies where China presently unilaterally does its own regulations about the scope for activities of international NGOs. But once we enshrine that kind of legal context in a bilateral trade agreement or investment agreement, then it is emphasized and it is corroborated, and it gets a bilateral blessing to what used to be a unilateral oppressive policy. And I recall, even though you said, Mr. Lang, that in the passing, after the passing of the foreign NGO law, there was only a low-level statement from the EU. I recall that at the time before that law was passed, there was quite some activity from the side of the EU trying to convince China that this was not a very positive policy they were going to pursue. So the EU did make some effort to fight for a better outcome. And now we would be basically signing off to in an international agreement to this Chinese practice. I am not sure that, as you said, passing or publishing a statement on the importance of freedom of association and free flow of transnational civil society funding would change that. Would change that effect very much. I mean, this would be like washing our hands in innocence. Yes, we have agreed to the Chinese practice, but we don't mean it. I mean, that could even be perceived as a bit hypocritical, I would say. But if we would be more ambitious, if we would want to, at least as you mentioned, at least make sure that China understands we're not willing to sign off on even on possibly even farther reaching restrictions of NGO activity. What tools would you say could we possibly go for? I mean, in the context of the Mercosur agreement, we are negotiating now about additional statements, because obviously there's no ratification of Mercosur without whatever addition on substance. Could you imagine doing something similar with CAI?
I mean, definitely yes. Just to clarify your hypocrisy argument, of course, that is true as long as you don't really insist, as long as you issue statements. And I think this is a very valid criticism of much of the EU's human rights policies towards China so far, that you issue statements that are very critical and very principled, but then in the end you don't change anything to your economic approach and to your trade policy. So such a statement could, of course, only be one step. But there is a difference in accepting that you cannot change the overseas NGO law from the outside, which I think is just realistically, in terms of the power balance, something we need to accept, and just endorsing it without clarifying that you find it problematic. So this difference, I think, needs to be highlighted. And also, more broadly, I think some of the other recommendations on ending the silo approach, for example, are more essential, which is tying the issue of non-profit investment to the issue of for-profit investment, and not allowing the two to be dissected and saying, okay, we're against the way you treat NGOs, but it's more important, and we're clearly signaling this, it's more important to us that our companies can make better business in China. I think this is also, I think, something that's under general review on the European policy level right now. As long as you signal that civil society is something you only mention in statements, and your own or European civil society actors are not an essential part of your policy, then of course you encourage further restrictions here. On the other hand, and I think before maybe we move to audience questions, I think it's really walking a tightrope here for a democratic polity as the EU, in not making civil society organizations the tool of your foreign policy, as I said in the beginning. On the one hand, and this is why I'm saying matter of principle, defending the freedom of association, which is enshrined in international law, which the EU has repeatedly said it would uphold, and which also China has, for example, subscribed to in the International Covenant on Economic Social Rights. This is something completely different from saying we want our NGOs to be able to do this or that in China, right? So this is a tightrope here. But all the more, I think this principle stands, and this close connection and this level playing field between non-profit and for-profit investments is all the more important.
Well, thanks again. And indeed, we should move on. And I want to compliment you again for the second service that you're doing to us in your study by highlighting the general context. And clearly, nobody knows at the time whether ratification of CAI will be on the table over the course of the next 7 years. I heard Jörg Wuttke once saying that it's been negotiated for 7 years. It might take 7 years to ratify. Nobody knows. But apart from that, obviously, the concerns that you're raising and the recommendations that you're making for better integration of business and political considerations and changing the procedures and the processes to include civil society and NGO perspectives, I think that's certainly very valuable and worth to be taken up by policymakers, including the European Parliament. But I would indeed hope that we can open the floor now also to questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you, Bertram Lang and Reinhard Bütikofer, for the presentation and the kickoff of the discussions, the very clear messages and very clear recommendations. We already do have two questions here. I will shortly read them. And to all of the other participants, if you want to put the questions to both panelists, use the Q&A function or raise your hands and we will unmute them. So there is one question coming from Gitan de Pelou. If there is a research and development company in China that the government considers strategic, would it be possible for the Chinese to convert the company into a nonprofit in order to prevent foreign investments? Maybe we can collect the questions and I will read the second one immediately after that. Thank you, Bertram. It's coming from Katja Levy. Thank you, Bertram, for your great study and presentation, if I may. I would like to ask Reinhard and you a bit more generally about the future China policy of the EU. How is the EU preparing the necessary cooperation on climate and other global issues with China against the background of the EU's new, more assertive policy outlook towards China? Are there any formats in preparation? Do you prepare any ideas how such formats could be developed? Which role could the various actors like governments, EU organs, NGOs, and businesses play in such a cooperation? Or are you not considering such cooperations at the moment at all? These were the first two, and I hand over first to Bertram and then to Reinhard Bütikofer.
Yes, so I'll take the first question first. This is, of course, a very clever idea, so to say, to use this clause that without the agreement or the approval of the Chinese government, foreign investors may not invest in non-profit organizations in China. I'm not aware of such an example that a company like a private startup, if we speak of private companies, would be transformed into something like a social organization in Chinese legal terms. But of course, there are many legally social organizations, so non-profit organizations in China today that are doing research and development activities, be it in affiliation with universities, or with other state-owned entities. So there is already a broad scope of non-profit organizations in which European investors would not or would only be allowed to invest with explicit approval by the Chinese government. And I would not exclude the possibility that you're raising here, although I haven't looked into this possibility and it's probably speculative.
Thank you, Bertram. Reinhard, would you like to add a few sentences to the second question?
Yeah. To Katja Levy's question, look, obviously, the EU has made it abundantly clear that we want to cooperate with China wherever that is possible. You go to the new German coalition agreement, you find similar text. It says we are seeking cooperation wherever possible on the basis of human rights and international law. What we're not going to do is sacrificing international law, sacrificing human rights just for the purpose of saying we want to cooperate on whatever other topic. So we're not willing to engage in a trade-off between, for instance, human rights and climate, but we're willing to cooperate with China very clearly and ambitiously. And the EU has been making these efforts under the guidance of Executive Vice President Timmermans, and the European Parliament has been doing that. We, as a China delegation, if you want a practical example, organized a meeting in the run-up to the COP26, where we focused on discussing about China's contribution to the COP26. Baiford Zhang, I think I saw him among the participants here, was one of the panelists that we had from E3G. And we also invited the Chinese mission to the EU to sent an expert to participate in the conversation. They didn't, because they said they had no adequate expert, whatever the case. But certainly the answer is an emphatic yes. But what we would not accept is what Wang Yi said at one occasion recently, that the Europeans and the Americans must make up their minds whether they want to cooperate on climate. And if they do, then they have to understand that they must cease criticizing, let's say, human rights violations in Xinjiang. That's not an option for us.
Thank you. Very clear.
Maybe can I add just one
yes.
point, because Katja also asked about the roles of different actors when it comes to climate. And I would just like to stress that although, of course, there has been this crackdown, on the other hand, what you also see is a continued expansion of the social organizations sector in China, and especially on issues like the environment and climate change. There is a vibrant nonprofit sector, although of course it's not openly critical of the government. It is a sector that we need to engage in, and of course this is also becoming increasingly difficult in a tense geopolitical situation, which is why I personally am kind of skeptical of things like sanctions against 4 individuals in China, because they do a lot of harm and achieve very little in terms of human rights and engagement. But that's a personal opinion more than an academic comment here. But what's really essential is that we follow up on what is happening here, also in terms of government procurement of services, but also of monitoring of Chinese business behavior abroad by Chinese social organizations, which can be intermediaries when it comes to talking about China's footprint in the global south, for example.
Thank you for the additional comments and answers. There's one question you have already in the beginning elaborated a bit, but maybe you can go there again. The question is raised. What was the Commission reasoning behind the decision to accept this policy space on NGOs in the Kai in the first place? You mentioned afterwards the process, the DG Trade said it's not a problem. You don't have to be afraid of anything, but maybe you can elaborate a little bit again on that. Thank you, Bertram.
Yes, so this is a thin line because we had a kind of closed door meeting there, and I don't think I can even anonymously disclose the actual reasoning that became apparent to me. But the broad picture here really is, I think, policy neglect, and this is why I'm putting this this blind spot center stage. So what can be clearly seen from the whole negotiation process is that NGOs and civil society just did not play a role in the whole process. There were these civil society dialogues, but they were mostly used to, for example, present the social impact assessment of the Kai, which was done by a for-profit consultancy and not by civil society actors. Present this to the attendees, which are mostly, as I showed, business representatives and some large NGOs, not necessarily those with China expertise. And DG Trade's negotiation team also appears way too small to incorporate all those issues. And I've heard parts of the Commission and of the EU bureaucracy that they were not integrated in the actual process. So there was no real way for inputs on this issue. And since no one really saw it coming, not even, I think, the EU delegation in Beijing, it was just not addressed at all and may just have been, may just have slipped through as not so important to the European side.
Well, if I may add there, I have not been in the closed door meetings, and so I'm not going to spill any secret beans. And on the other hand, I have had several opportunities to ask officials from DG Trade about this issue, and the kind of answers that I got point in the very same direction that Mr. Lang also pointed to. I don't think they did it on purpose. I don't think they did it knowing full well what they were doing. I really believe that there was a kind of negligence, and maybe the fact that the agreement was rushed in the very last few days of last December also contributed to not having another round of sort of studiously looking at all the provisions and all the possible implications that they had. But certainly, I think they it would be good if Commission would own up to the fact that they, in my assessment, frankly, made a mistake in that regard. They should have negotiated differently, and they should have negotiated for a different result in that regard. So even if it was not with a bad intention, still the outcome is not favorable. The outcome is not acceptable, and that's why we not only have to learn for future processes, which we of course would hope to do, but also we have a problem on our hands trying to save us from the implications of what has been agreed there. But of course, and I repeat this, we're not yet close to discussing a ratification because there are impediments, as everybody knows. It would, however, be very helpful if Commission would acknowledge that there is an issue that should be addressed.
Thank you, Reinhard. We are slowly already reaching the end of our webinar, but there are still 2 more questions as far as I can see. I don't know, Bertram, if you are aware of Chinese NGOs working and operating in Europe. How many are active and what's the nature of their activities is one question. And a second question is, are there already concrete designs for efficient EU funding instruments for civil society? What would be the essential hallmarks for such new funding structures? Question coming from Manfred Hornung. Bertram, you want to start? We still have 2 more minutes, so please be brief.
Okay, so on the first one, there are a couple of activities, but the focus of Chinese NGOs going abroad is clearly along the Belt and Road Initiative. So most of the activities in terms of poverty alleviation, but also what has been framed here as vaccine diplomacy. So Chinese private companies offering medical equipment and vaccines has clearly focused on Southeast Asia and Africa. Some NGOs have set up offices in countries like Ethiopia. In Europe, we had some initial activities, for example, donations to Central and Eastern Europe, also of medical equipment by Chinese foundations. But and there's also some organizations in the UK, but it's very, very limited so far, and it's not. It's only a policy focus in the framework of the Belt and Road Initiative, which, yeah, still includes Central and Eastern Europe, but not so much Western Europe. This is also, by the way, can be explained by the fact that the focus of those NGOs themselves, so not only by Communist Party policy, but the focus of these NGOs themselves is clearly on what they have done domestically in China, so poverty alleviation and social care, etc. Much more than these great ambitions of strategic philanthropy that we tend to have in the US and in Europe. The second question, should I also?
Well, let me take that. Very shortly, the question goes way beyond the scope of this webinar. And I would say by the nature of the matter, it's impossible to design one concrete mechanism for funding civil society from the EU budget. So we would have to tackle that question in a different context.
So just one sentence that comes up in the study is definitely to look more into what we can do in third countries. So in terms of funding activities that are China related, but not only carried out in China or Europe. And this is a major administrative concern so far. For example, in Germany, this is very hard to do. And from what I understood from interviews is that actually EU delegations in third countries could do a lot more to provide funding for China-related activities. And personally, I would not frame them as purely addressing concerns about the Chinese presence, but also to look at how to engage Chinese actors that are on the ground in those third countries that I just mentioned, that China views as Belt and Road countries, and we tend to refer to as the Global South.
All right, thank you. It's already 1 p.m., 1 minute past 1 p.m. We only had 1 hour, but the discussions clearly show that there is a big need for continuing this debate and to really go also deeper into the question of what can also civil society organizations do? How can they maybe connect more or talk and discuss about their strategies and how to talk to EU when it comes to Kai negotiations and maybe a reopening of the negotiations. I would like to thank my excellent panelists, Bertram Lang and Reinhard Bütikofer. It was a wonderful debate, having the honor to follow your discussions. I would like to thank all the participants who stayed until the very end of this webinar today. As I said in the beginning, it's planned to have an in-person event in spring or early next year, which is in fact then a cooperation with the Heinrich Böll Foundation. The link to the study of Bertram Lang is now in the chat. It will be, it's available on the website of Reinhard Bütikofer. There you will also later find the presentation of Bertram Lang and the video of this webinar. I would like to thank all of you for your participation, your contribution to the discussions, and hope to see you then for the next event. Reinhard, would you like, since it's your event, would you like to have the last final word today?
Yes, and I want to use it to thank you, Christina. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, and have a good afternoon. Bye.